Hello, everyone. My name is Carissa Craven. If you have not met me, I am the program coordinator in the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. And I'm going to go over the IRB application as a whole. Think of it kind of like a speed date with the application because it does have a lot of pieces, and then the documents required kind of change based on how you answer the application. So starting with knowing that it's human subjects research is the first big thing. Because if it is not human subjects research, you're going to do a whole lot of work for nothing. So make sure it does meet that federal category before you start by knowing to know. So we're going to look at the application so that you see what information you need to know and any documents you might need to gather based on what you want to be doing. So there are 15 sections of the application. So if you do go back into this slideshow, which is available in our resources tab on our website, each of these will jump to those individual sections. So you don't have to go through all 100 slides to find what you're looking for. And then each slide will also jump you back to this table of contents as you need it. So starting is knowing where to find the application. So if you go to our website, uis.edu/research, under the IRB and integrity programs, there is a link specifically for the Institutional Review Board. And all of our forms and resources are under forms and resources. So you'll have to scroll down a little bit to find the table of all the potential documents you might need, which is why it's kind of a speed date because there's a lot of potential. So we do have two versions of the application. My personal suggestion is to use the Word version. For whatever reason, the PDF, once you save, it's not as friendly to edit. So I would say start with the Word version, submit the Word version, and then if any revisions are needed, it's easier in the back and forth. So it is a 12-page document to start. As you enter things, it could get a little bit longer, it could get a lot longer. But if it's your first IRB application ever, or your first in a while, this is a different document than it was a couple years ago. So you would want to refresh yourself. Different federal regulations have changed in the last 6 years. Just make sure you understand what the newest version is. So while it is very extensive, it is because of federal regulations. It is the IRB's job to protect you as a researcher, your participants, as well as the university from a lot of different liability categories. So we are pretty strict with those compliance things. But again, we're here to help you make sure you know what the compliance things are as well. So that very first page, you'll put the responsible principal investigator's last name, the project title, which will be consistent throughout all of your documents, as well as the date you first submit it to the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. Several things to note in those guidelines is please make sure it's typed, not handwritten, and don't drop it off at our desks in our office. Make sure that you've answered everything. If it doesn't apply, there are buttons to hit either no or not applicable. Just please don't leave them blank because that makes us think you just skipped it or missed it or forgot it. But hitting that not applicable lets us know you acknowledge that it's there. Make sure it is clear. We are not necessarily experts in your field, so try to avoid any discipline-specific jargon or technical terms because a lot of different people may review this who are in different fields. And then only include text in the provided text boxes. This is not a journal application or a manuscript. We don't need to see all of your tables and charts. We just need the basic description of what everything is. And again, they will expand as needed. So in case I forgot to say it, just make sure you don't leave any section blank. Again, if it doesn't apply, make sure we know that it doesn't apply. I will send back blank sections for revision, or whoever else is reviewing it in our office will send it back. So there's a checklist on that first page as well. Make sure it's complete. All questions are answered. Everyone has signed on the last page. Make sure it is a wet signature or an e-signature that is verified. If it's just typed in, that does get sent back for official signature. And then everyone who is on the research team needs to complete the CITI training, and it has to have been completed in the last 3 years. And there are 5 quizzes minimum that each have to have an 80% or higher on them. Anything that applies, you'll need to make sure you include, whether that's informed consent, assent, parental permission, recruitment, research guides, interview guides, or letters of support. And I will get into each of those as we go. But we are going to start with CITI program because no matter what you have, this is a required element along with your application. So the CITI program website is citiprogram.org. If you have never gone into it before, you will register. And then the least intuitive part of it is that you will not log in through your organization. You will just register, but you will select an organization. And because we are the smallest of the U of I system campuses, we do affiliate with Champaign's campus. It will offer you two options. Make sure you choose the one that is just University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and not the single sign-on option. Our logins, our net IDs do not work with the Champaign single sign-on option, which is why we can't log in through the organization. So once you do that, you will agree, you will affirm that you are who you are, that you are part of the U of I system, and then you can log in. And this is kind of what it'll look like. It'll look a little different if it's your first time. Probably haven't taken 23 different courses. You wouldn't have that year of membership, but the general look will be the same. And you will need to view your courses, even though you haven't added any yet, unless you have. And then you will need to scroll to the bottom to the learner tools to add a course. So at minimum, the course you need is answered in question 1 for IRB training. And again, if you have not done an IRB application at UIS in a few years, this is different than it was just, I think, 4 years ago. So make sure you're not turning in the social behavioral research course. It is not what the IRB requires. We'll make you go back and take, I think, 2 additional modules that are not on the old course. So you'll answer core IRB. If that is the only one you need to take, you can scroll down to the bottom and submit. However, this is the minimum for each member of your research team. Any students that will have access to data, anyone recruiting, anyone analyzing any part of the human subjects part of research needs to do this. If you are doing international research, there is additional training that needs to be done. If you are doing research with minors or in public schools, you will need additional training. Research with prisoners, research with pregnant women or the fetuses, those all require additional training. If those don't apply, obviously you don't have to take those trainings. There are 9 questions. You can also take additional training just for funsies if you really want to. And finally, at the end, you'll hit submit, and then it will add them into your courses ready to begin. You do not have to finish them in one sitting. Once you start them, they will add to your active courses. Apparently, I'm forgetting some arrows. It'll add to your active courses, and then you can kind of go as you wish. The core course can take between an hour, 3 hours, depending on how fast you are. And sometimes you don't have that much time at once to dedicate, so you can go back and do those lessons and quizzes. When you do finish it, you need to provide us the score report. That's also a different requirement than it was a couple of years ago. We don't want just the certificate. We need to see each individual score. To access that, it is under My Records. You will see the different courses. Make sure it's the name you need. View, print, share. You will do the completion report, not the certificate. You can do both, but at minimum, we do need that report so we can make sure you have at least 80% per quiz. And so what that kind of looks like is this. These are the 5 different modules required with the core IRB course. And we'll see if you have at least 80%. And then if you did not get an 80% the first go round, when it updates, it does not update on page 1 for whatever reason. Page 1 is frozen. It will update on page 2. And then international research is 1 quiz. Elementary school and secondary schools is 1 quiz. With children, with prisoners, those are all just 1 quiz each. The core IRB is the main one that has multiple modules. Checking for this course. So then section 1 is hopefully the easiest section because it's all about who is leading the research. Currently, with the current policy, this can be faculty or a student. If it is a student, they do have to be supervised by faculty. Later on in the section, that policy will be updating before too long. So just be aware that this section will likely change before long. So just entering the information hopefully you know your name, you know where your office is, and you know what your status is as well. Here is where you will tell us what the training is that you've taken. We will verify it against your score reports as well. And then if it is a student, if it is staff who does not have a research or teaching appointment, then they can also be supervised by faculty. And we would just need that information so that we know that they're being trained by someone who has the qualifications to do so. And Lucia didn't know that she was my example, but that is something that would be needed. If there are additional researchers beyond that lead researcher or a supervisor, this is where it's going to trigger additional documentation. If there's no other researchers, you don't need a research team form. But if you answer yes, it says include a research team form. And again, this is the speed date with these sections. So if you do want to go more in depth about collaborative research as well as international research, there is a training on that in November where we can dive further into the minutia there. So with a research team form, we do have two different versions. If you have a small research team and there are only 4 additional researchers, that top one is a shorter form. If you are teaching and all of your students are going to be collaborators, then there is one that has up to, I think, 60 lines so that you can add them all onto that instead of multiple small forms. So the short form kind of looks like this. There is a section for up to 4 additional investigators, and they will each sign this. You can kind of see the information that needs to go into that. And then the other version that has a lot more room does not require nearly as much information. And my other colleagues didn't know they were examples. But if I had a bigger team, this is the information I would need to put in there. Other things that could trigger additional documentation is if you have researchers not affiliated with the U of I system, in which case there's potential that a reliance agreement would be required. This is one that's really a discussion with the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs because it may require a completely separate review at their campus, but in some cases a reliance agreement is needed. And if that is needed and you want to see what that looks like, it is also in our forms and resources. Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah, if my coworker, system is different country where IRB is not required, then how can I manage that?
So we have to go and see what their country's requirements are. We have to have you contact whatever their equivalent is. If there's an ethics board, if there's a university IRB equivalent, we would have to get in contact with them. And if there is no equivalent, we would have to get an expert in the culture and customs to know what the right process is, because we're not experts in their laws. And
I'm from Bangladesh, and some faculty from my old university, they contact me. So I cannot answer how it's possible. So who will contact with that university? Actually, in my country, there is no IRB board, no requirement for collecting data.
so we start with the Office of Human Health and Research. Is that what OHRRP? So we will see what they say about that country. They have a huge set of international standards. And there are some countries that don't have those requirements, but we still have to do our due diligence to confirm that they don't have those requirements.
So in that case, should I write here when I will apply for IRB here in my university? Should I write the name here and explain?
Yes, there's a whole other document that I'm going to go over that has that as well. And then the more in-depth, that will also be on November 1st, where we'll talk about international collaborators.
And in the last seminar, I also asked a question like, if they just help me for writing, then it is not necessary to mention in IRB.
Right.
They will not access data.
Right.
If they want to collect data from that country, then I have to mention the name and.
Yes, and that may include some sort of export control, but it's that lovely, it depends. So it depends on the country, it depends on the person. We do a quick search in a visual compliance database just to make sure that they're not on a sanctioned country, that there's nothing dinging their name. Which usually there isn't, but it's that just in case due diligence that we do. Yes, we have lots of processes for these. We definitely want to encourage that collaboration to make sure everyone is safe. So that reliance agreement, if we do have it, It is on our website as well. It is sometimes called an institutional authorization agreement, a reliance agreement, a deferral. It's any sort of thing like that, we'll call it. And what that is just a document between both IRBs. One of them is saying, yep, we're in charge of it. It's our jurisdiction. And the other is saying, we defer to your expertise. We accept your approval, and you're the one who's in charge of it if anything needs to happen. So both investigators at the sites will have that. We will get their IRB registration number. We'll get their federal-wide assurance number. Just making sure all the boxes are checked that need to be. And then we get into the protocol study design, which is really the bulk of your work, where you tell us what you're doing in enough detail that we know if we can approve it or not and under what category, as well as not going so far in depth that you are super tied into your details and that any little change you might make requires an amendment. So it's kind of finding that balance between enough detail but not too much detail, which is kind of an art. It takes some work, and we work with you as well with revisions. And I do want to disclose openly, because this is such a bulky document, I use ChatGPT for a lot of my things. I did not check it for quality, just to make sure it wasn't blank. So don't look for a quality example, just look for an example. But you do want to make sure it's in that lay language. You're not using that field-specific jargon so that I can understand, the reviewers can understand. There's not a lot of back and forth because we don't understand what you're saying. So you'll need to know your title, either your hypotheses or your research questions, as well as your objectives or your specific aims. This might be just a couple, it might be more extensive. You will need to know your research procedures, the methods in the order that they will be completed, and you will tell us the expected benefits to society. Again, enough detail that we understand, but not so much that we are confused. You will have to manage your data. We'll need to know who has access, where will the data be stored, when will it be destroyed, how will it be destroyed, and UIS policy does require you to retain data at least 3 years after the end of the study, unless it's sponsored research and they require you to delete it earlier. If that's the case, you do have to tell us in this section. And we would also need a copy of that sponsored research agreement, which comes up later. And then we need your data analysis plan. And that does have to be in enough detail that we know qualitative, quantitative, mixed method, what exactly you're doing. Don't just say, this is the norm in my field. I don't know the norm in your field. Give me a little more so that we know exactly what you're doing. You don't have to tell us every single little detail, but give us enough that we can review it. We need to make sure that it does have a research base. You will provide a bibliography, whether that is for the actual content or the methods or both. Locations where research will take place, if that is on campus, if it's a specific place off campus, if it's online, and then approximate study date. And then if the location is outside of the US, we would, or not US, UIS, we just need a letter of support from that site to say that you have permission and support to use their facilities, their resources. Just making sure we know what that looks like. And this is an example of what that support letter might say. It confirms that my offsite location, the University of Examples, is supporting my research and that they agree to give me access to participants, to their facilities, to whatever they have agreed to help me complete my research. More of the protocol study design, we need to know what your methods or data sources are, and any that you check, we will need a copy of that. So if you are doing a survey that is on paper, a survey that's online, and you are doing an interview, we will need to see 3 separate documents, unless the paper and online copy are exactly the same, which is not necessarily the case. So you will tell us exactly what those are, that they are attached. And then if you are using anything else, such as data collected internationally, if you are using translated documents, each of those will trigger a new document that is required. So for research materials, because I said I had a survey as well as an interview, I would want to include both of those questions.
Here I have another question.
Yes, sir.
Like, if we collect data from platform like Amazon through like this kind of platform,
Yeah.
so it will be considered international data collection.
If you are specifically targeting it, yes. If there's potential for it, we might need to put in additional language for either the EU GDPR laws, or we may need to put in PIPL for China, or you may have to make that an exclusion criteria if that is a consideration. So that was the research copies. For international research, there's an additional checklist, and because each country does have its own set of rules, you kind of have to do your due diligence to make sure you know what those are. That checklist is under our checklist and guidelines, and there are a lot of requirements to make sure that you are qualified, allowed, you understood what the laws are, you understand what the customs are. How do we contact people if there's an issue while it's happening out of the country? Do they have a local number? Is there a translator? How are they being protected? There's a lot more work that goes into international research, as well as potential export controls. And if it is a country with another language that needs to be translated, we need a copy of the translated document as well as a certificate saying that person is qualified to translate it. If that is you, you're the one completing that translation certificate. If it is someone outside of the university and they will also be translating data, a non-disclosure agreement may be another additional document. So again, in our forms, certificate of translation, letting us know what protocol it's for, who is the translator, what language are they translating, what documents are they translating, when, and all of the qualifications and signature. So if I was doing this in Quebec in Canada, I would want to have the English version, and I would want my translator to specifically translate into Quebecois because it is not specifically French there. It is a little bit different. I do not speak French. I do not speak Quebecois. So I need to hire someone to do that for me. A much shorter, easier section is funding information. This is if it is funded by you, if you are buying it out of your own pocket, if it is funded by your unit out of professional development funds or indirect cost recovery, or if it is specifically sponsored research. Those would all be situations where you would say yes. If you are applying for something and hoping to get funding, you would say yes, there's a pending decision. If it is funded or potentially will be funded, let us know from where, if it's not applicable in A. And then we would need a copy of the application or contract to know exactly what is and is not allowed with data collection. Like I said, self-funded, professional development funds, other internal mechanism, just indicate what that is. And like I said, always more paperwork can be triggered by different answers. So this may look like a sponsored research agreement. Typically our office would have it anyway, but just in case, make sure we've got a copy of it. There might be terms and conditions that do and don't allow certain data to be collected, shared, all of that good stuff with contracts. Conflicts of interest may or may not be an issue, but if you have any sort of financial interest, a fiduciary relationship with either the sponsor or anything else that could be related to the research, that more than likely needs a conflict of interest management plan. It's probably already in place when you've done your report of non-university activities, but just in case, be aware of that. And not necessarily something that needs management is if you are working with a family member on research. It might be, a married couple working on the same research. It might be, parents, child, siblings, different relationships are okay. It might need management if there's a supervisory relationship, a mentorship relationship, and that's just something where we might email asking for more details. It might not necessarily be additional documentation, or it might. So that management plan, if you do need it, again, back to our website, conflict of interest management plan. This is a system-wide management plan, so some of the names may need updated, but the content is the same. But it will tell us what that conflict of interest is and what is being done to make sure that they are not overlapping in this research. Participants and recruitment. Whew, I feel like I'm running a marathon right now. So there's a lot that goes into your recruitment. And while this looks like a lot, this is just a section that requires checkboxes. So it's not too terrible. We just need to know the age, gender, race, ethnicity, if there are college students being recruited, or any other potentially vulnerable populations. And then some of these may trigger additional documents. If you are not targeting anyone, if it's pretty open, adults, no targeted sex, no targeted race, no targeted college population, it's pretty simple. One I did forget to add is this complete campus-wide survey request form. If you are planning to send a survey out to over 10% of the student population, there is an additional request that needs to be approved before you can actually send that, just so we're not inundating people's emails unnecessarily. I will need to add that to this slideshow later. We need to know why you've selected that, making sure that it is a fair and ethical selection, that you're not targeting populations that really should not be targeted. If there are any additional reasons for including anyone, excluding anyone, and then how do you plan to recruit them? Email distribution, MTurks, or Qualtrics panel, anything like that. If you check multiple things, we will need multiple attachments. We just need a copy of what you're planning to send out. Often if it is like, Qualtrics, Prolific, they have a pretty generic recruitment email that they send out. You can send that to us as well. So if I am emailing people, I need to have a copy of what that email is. And again, because I'm doing it in Canada, I need that French version as well. We need to know how you are recruiting them, making sure we're going through the ethical processes. Who is contacting them? How are they doing that? Are they being compensated before, during, or after? And if they are, just telling us what that compensation is, making sure it is, equivalent to what the risk versus benefit is, describing what those benefits might be. It's okay if there's none. Sometimes it's just for the good of society. They're not getting anything out of it. Entering none is okay. Just don't leave it blank. Letting us know how long they are participating and how many times. So because I have two different ones, the survey might take 10 minutes and an interview might be an hour. So I will have those different pieces lined out. Data confidentiality and privacy is, again, a very big section. So in a couple weeks, there will be a much more in-depth workshop on this section. But the gist of it is knowing what you are collecting, what you are disseminating, and how you are protecting personal information. So you might not be collecting any at all. It's 100% anonymous, totally fine. You might be collecting it, but keeping it private and confidential, also an option. You might be collecting those indirect identifiers. You might say, 18-year-old white male. You might not give them that. It might be a code based on how you're doing these. And we need to know if the research team has that identity key or not. And then any ways you are safeguarding that can be checked. And then the last three would require a little more information if you select them. Informed consent, also a huge topic. That is in 2 weeks. We'll be doing a workshop on that because there are so many ifs and it depends and different answers depending on the situation. But consent has to be collected ethically according to federal regulations, and there are a certain set of elements that have to be required unless explicitly waived. So normally it's just a signed document. If it is a minor, it would be an assent document. They can't legally sign, but kids can still tell you, okay, I want to do this or I do not want to do this. They are allowed to advocate for themselves. If it's an online document, it does not make sense to get a physical signature. We could waive the requirement just for the documentation, just removing the signature requirement. That also works for anonymous surveys. If you are protecting the identity and the only connection would be that signature, or if it is not the cultural norm, we could waive the signature. If you need to waive specific elements, if it would affect the integrity of your data. For example, deception, you might be removing some elements and you'd have to tell a little more later. If you are observing publicly and giving them informed consent would ruin what you're observing, it would tell them to act a different way. We might need to completely waive your informed consent. So you check to tell us what all is attached, and we do have that checklist of all the federal and university requirements. If you do not want to complete a consent form from scratch, we have a template for you. If you want to double check it, or if you do want to start it from scratch, I will get to that in a different slide. But this is what that template looks like. It'll tell you what to enter in brackets. The yellow sections will tell you what to delete after you have that information. But it will make sure you have the purpose. It will introduce who is doing it, what their affiliation is, what are the risks and benefits, how is their information being protected. It's making sure that everyone is doing what they're supposed to be doing. If there are multiple research activities, there will be different consent documents. I would have a different one for my survey versus my interview. So this is where the elements of informed consent are. It's a bunch of check boxes, making sure we have everything. PI information, we know the purpose, the procedures, how long and what are they doing, risks and potential discomforts, potential benefits. You just check it to make sure it's all there. If you don't check it, we will. And those waivers. They look very similar, but they have very different purposes. So if you are just waiving a signature for an online reason or for any other reason, you only have to answer one question on the waiver of documentation, whichever of the 3 questions applies. So this is what that looks like. It will tell you to only answer one, whether it's to protect confidentiality, if it is because it is no risk and it's an online survey, it does not require a signature typically, or if it is not the cultural norm in that country, are the 3 different options. Then if you are waiving informed consent completely, it is a different consent form or waiver form where you have to answer all of the questions because that is a much higher risk. It is a higher liability. And it's if you're removing any of those 8 federal elements of informed consent. If you are using proxy, if someone else is legally signing on behalf, you would answer yes. If no, just make sure you answer no or not applicable. And then tell us what the consent process actually is. How will they be contacted? Who is obtaining consent? Where? How? All of that good information. And then steps to reduce the possibility of coercion or undue influence if you are in a position of power with the subjects you are recruiting. These are things to really just make sure you're safely and ethically doing that. Sometimes subjects will sign immediately when they learn about the study. Sometimes they get the consent form in advance and they can think about it before they sign. We just need to know one way or the other. And if it's not immediate, how long is the waiting period? And then do they receive a copy of the informed consent for their records? Typically, this answer should be yes. But if the answer is no, if you're waiving consent, if it's natural observations and it wouldn't make sense, if it's a field of 1,000 people and you're observing them, sometimes it's just not feasible to do. And you would just explain that in 8G. Dissemination, obviously, we want to share our results. We just need to know how you plan to do that. Journal articles, academic paper, conference, posters, how are you sharing this? If things are completely internal, if it is only for program evaluation, it may not be considered to be human subjects research. So this is one of those things we can determine which way it falls if it's on a blurry line. If you are disseminating identifiers, we need to make sure that that is explicitly in the consent form. And is it required to participate, or do they have an option to remove that? And then are you putting this into a data repository? Are you storing it somewhere? And if so, just letting us know how it's de-identified. Just a general understanding of when the expected completion date of the research is. Depending on level of risk, typical approval durations are 1 year or 3 years. So this gives us an idea of how many continuations we're expected to see, if there's going to be a lot of continuing review, just gives the board a general idea of that. And we just double check to make sure that you have told your subjects that you are keeping records for 3 years after the completion of the study. Since it is their information, they need to be aware of what is being stored and for how long.
Yeah, what do you mean by completion of this research? Sometimes what we do, we collect data now for several research paper. I mean, when we just work on a project, meaning we may write 1, 2, 3, or 4, several others.
Yeah.
So maybe right now I can publish one paper, and after 5 years I can write another paper.
Yes.
So, and
So-
sometimes it happened that one paper is go to several journal and reject, and we correct it. Takes several years to complete. So in that case, how can we say when we will close this research?
Yeah, so that completion date is just an estimate. You are not tied to that. You're not signing a contract to that. If a manuscript does take longer to be approved, if there's more revisions, we can, if you request it, we can issue a continuation, and you're allowed to have access to the identifiable data longer. If it is completely de-identified, you have no more analysis, no more interviews, no more recruitment. Technically, the human subjects part of that is done.
To avoid this, I mean, resubmission, can we just say 12 years or 20 years?
We would like a specific date. It's just an estimate. Yeah, specific date with that. Again, you're not tied to it. It just gives us an idea of what a good approval would be. So again, minimizing that risk, we really don't want to interfere or influence the voluntary nature of informed consent. So sometimes there is nothing that's going to influence that. But if you are the instructor of a course, we need to make sure that you're not requiring it as an assignment, because now it's no longer voluntary. Their grade depends on it. If you are a supervisor or the unit head or any other type of that power differential, we need to know how that is being minimized and making sure it's voluntary. They don't feel like their job is on the line. If there's a close relationship, they might feel like they have to because they're friends with you. Just anything that might make it not voluntary, we need to know that, and we need to see what you're doing to make sure that it's minimized as much as it's able to be. Then consent may be obtained in English, it might be in another language. A different language might be understood by the person signing, so that is something we need to be aware of. If it's happening at a foreign location, our big ones right now are the EU or China. But again, if it is in other countries, we are going to look into those specifically. Those are just two of the biggest data protection laws out there right now, are in China and the European Union. If it includes pregnant women, fetuses, neonates, we need to make sure that consent is obtained depending on what you are doing. If it is specifically, on infant still in the womb or anything like that, there may need to be consent from both parents if possible. And then consent often needs to be obtained from one parent or both parents, depending on the level of risk to the child, unless there is an extenuating circumstance. But that is information we would get at this point. And then we kind of get your thoughts on the risk. Does it pose more than minimal risk? Does it include deception? Does it include vulnerable populations, whether it's minors or any others checked in 6B, such as prisoners, those who may not understand English as fully or above the 8th grade level? There's different things that make them vulnerable populations. And in these cases, it may go to a higher level of review, even up to a full board review. If you did choose deception, we do need to know what the debriefing protocol is, if there is one. If you are just withholding certain information, but it would be helpful for them to know after they've answered truthfully, you would need to tell us what that debriefing plan is. Usually it's not applicable, but if it is, tell us what you're doing. So this would be an example of a debriefing form, a purpose, an explanation, what was withheld, why it was withheld, what we were actually looking for. If you are doing a clinical study, again, not always applicable, but sometimes telling us how you are keeping things safe, how often it's being checked, who is checking it. Some sponsors do require you to have an entire data safety team monitoring your data, and because this is usually a higher risk protocol. So that might look even more. You might have a data safety and monitoring committee. They're meeting quarterly, they're reviewing things, they're just checking in on you. And then, of course, the assurances. You are saying, I did this right, this is the best information I have. I know I have ultimate responsibility. I'm following UIS policies. I am following federal policies. If it's in another country, I'm following their policies. And you understand that this is your protocol. If anything is changed after you submit this, it will need an amendment. If it's approved, we can make changes as much as we need to before it's approved. But just knowing changes need to be addressed and approved. And then you sign it. This would not be accepted because it's typed, but if it was actually signed or digitally signed, we would accept that. So, all of that information is on our research site. The forms are following a few different breadcrumbs, and then our email is always open and available for you. I didn't know if I would get through all that in an hour. We did it. Then I still have time for questions. Are there any in the chat or any in person? Yes, absolutely. Was I just that good? No questions? All right, if any do come up, you guys are welcome to email ORA, mine personally. We want to make sure your research gets approved. We're not trying to stop you. We're just keeping everybody protected, making sure if we get audited, you're protected, we're protected. Everybody's good. Oh my goodness. All right, well, thank you all for attending. This might be one of our best numbers so far. So if you need anything, again, just reach out to us and we will get you squared away. Can we get the recording? Yes. So it does take me a little bit to get everything edited, make sure the sound quality is good. But yes, it's on our YouTube channel and that link is in our resources page as well. But I do usually get those updated day of. Absolutely, you're very welcome.